businesses die of indigestion, not starvation. They overeat, they're not starving. It's the entrepreneur that, and this is like, you get back to human behavior, which almost all roads lead back to it, but the entrepreneurs get reinforced for changing direction. Because nothing worked. You change direction, something clicks. And so what happens is you learn a lesson from that. You're like, oh, so if I change direction, good things happen. But that's not the right lesson, which is one of my favorite things about entrepreneurship, is making sure that we learn the right lesson from the instance or the circumstance. It's like, I hired a sales guy, he did a bad job, all sales guys suck. Not the right lesson, right? But that's actually something that is pervasive in even the internet community, of like lessons that people, they'll tell the story and then they'll say the lesson, but sometimes the lesson, all we know is the facts of what happened, not necessarily the thing you took from it. The higher up in business you get, the more attractive the opportunities that you have to learn to say no to. And this has been really hard for me because at every level, like I thought, great, I can check the box on distractions. I've learned to say no to $10,000 opportunities. But then when you're making $100,000, then you have to be able to say no to $100,000 opportunities. In the Matrix, Morpheus takes him through a training program to teach him one thing about agents. And so they're walking down the street and there's all these people going, and he says, were you listening to me or were you looking at the woman in the red dress? And he says, look again. Looks back, and the woman in the red dress who walked by is an agent pointing a gun in his head. And I see distractions the same way, which is that the better you become, the more attractive the woman in the red dress is. And so you can say no to a 6, but what about a 7?
What about a 12?
Exactly. What about a hypothetical 1,000?
Yeah.
Right? Like that's really what it becomes, because there is no limit on the upside. And so that's why having like some of the soft stuff of like, this is the vision, this is what we're trying to do, and there's 100 other things I could do, but each of the cost of those things is the one thing that matters most. Warren Buffett said that the difference between really successful people and the most successful people is that the most successful people say no to almost everything. And I've tried to take that because it's so hard. Success comes down to doing the obvious thing for an extraordinary period of time without convincing yourself you're smarter than you are.
Why do you not need to convince yourself that you're smarter than you are if you're doing the same thing?
I think it's because you think you can handle both. And so you're like, oh, I got this.
Oh, okay. Because if you did think that you were smarter than you are, you would then start to take on more stuff. So a quote from John Maxwell, which I absolutely adore, that says, you cannot overestimate the unimportance of practically everything.
You don't build confidence by shouting affirmations in the mirror, but by stacking...
Having an undeniable stack of proof that you are who you say you are.
Thank you. That's
outwork your self-doubt.
A lot of people were like, no, but what if you don't have any successes? Like, how do you get started? And I still think that the quote is 100% valid. It's that they don't realize the validity of the smaller things that they have done up to that point. And so it's being able to transfer your successes of like, okay, like, did you get dressed this morning? Did you get in front of the computer? Like, you have evidence, it's smaller evidence, but you have enough evidence to make the claim that you can do this. And then you do that enough times that you have enough evidence to make a claim that you can do this and support it. And I think that's where the big outcomes come from, lots of constrained tiny impulses of saying like, you know what, I'm going to get this tiny victory and I know how to say no to that. I know to say no to heroin today or whatever.
Yep.
That would be a hard one, you know.
Larger impulse, yeah.
Probably larger. But that's the idea, is just stacking as many of those pieces of evidence that give you proof that you are who you say you are, that you have done what you say you can do. A lot of the big wins, you know, like Uber's the classic example, right? Like, let's start a business where strangers pick up girls who are 16, you know what I mean, and drive them to their friends' houses. Like, that sounds like a terrible idea, right? Like but in retrospect, you're like, no, it'll be totally fine because there's going to be a mutual rating system and blah, 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 blah. And the thing is like, just because we're on the investing side, what we found is that there are always reasons to say no to a deal. You can always find reasons to say no because there's nothing that's risk-free. Even treasuries have risk. The US economy could collapse and treasuries could be worth nothing. And you could create a really compelling argument. Lots of influencers spend a lot of time doing that, right? Is it likely? Maybe, I don't know, but it's probably less likely than a bank failing. Because if the US fails, all the banks by default are also failing. So which of these is greater risk? So then you start comparing risks rather than trying to eliminate risks. And so if we're looking at opportunities, that's why like risk-adjusted return is one of the things that a lot of investors look at, which is like, is there a way that I can appropriately adjust this risk to normalize different opportunities? And I think that single skill set is one of, if not the most important skill sets as an entrepreneur, because fundamentally it's betting. Like, that's what we're doing. We're making bets. Every day we bet with our time, we bet with our money, with the limited constraints we have or limited resources we have against unlimited opportunities. Because that's the hard part, is that it's unlimited women in the red dress. Now there's some 4s and there's some 6s and there's some 8s, but you have to both rate the girl, right? The opportunity, and then also how crazy is she, right? Or whatever, whatever risk factor you want to, associate with this. Is she going to stab me in my sleep? I don't know, right? Does she have a crazy ex-boyfriend I don't know about? I don't know, right? And so that's why we do the diligence process. But like when we're organizing opportunities that we're going to pursue with a business, we look at what are the ones that we have the absolute highest likelihood of success, that we need no new skills and no new effort. If we can do that, or the least amount of new effort and no new skills, that would be the first thing we're going to do. And then once we take off all the ones that take basically no effort and no extra skills, we're like, okay, which ones take more effort and still no skills? And then once we do that, then we're like, okay, now we can start learning a new skill. And of the different skills that we could learn, which of these is going to give us the highest leverage, as in most output for the least amount of input? And that's pretty much how we tick down which of these opportunities we want to pursue, because those have the lowest likelihood of not happening. I think that the investor frame is simply people who have been scored and quantified on their ability to make decisions. And so I think that we can learn a ton from how investors make decisions overall. It's like why Ray Dalio's book, Principles, became like a bestseller, even though 99.9% of people who are reading the book aren't even investors, or definitely not investors at his level. But the principles of good decision making are just quantified, and we have a scoreboard for these guys being excellent decision makers. Whereas most other people, you don't have a real scoreboard, so we can't tell how valid is their advice. And I think that's what makes taking advice from really world-class investors who've been doing it for decades as a great source of information, because we can validate that they have a stack of undeniable proof that they are who they say they are.